Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Overwater. In the year 84 of the Common Reckoning, Grimbold marched an army of 750 Skeldings toward the halfling town of Overwater. As the Skeldings approached Overwater, the population panicked. Large numbers of halflings simply fled northward toward Dwarfbridge. But one halfling, whose name is unknown, made himself a banner and stood in the marketplace, calling on his fellows to stand with him and fight for their homes. Having gathered a force of some 700 halflings to him, he led them out to meet the approaching Skeldings. The halfling force consisted of approximately 200 halflings with slings and a similar number with bows. There were also about 300 halflings with spears. As well as residents of Overwater, the halfling army included some bands of halflings who had been raiding Skelding farms on the border and had retreated before the advancing Skeldings, and some of these were veterans of the Battle of Fishpond. About a mile south of Overwater, the Skeldings' line of march passed between two halfling farmsteads, and it was here that the unknown halfling leader determined to make his stand. He arrayed his spear halflings in the gap between those farms, with a small detachment of slingers immediately on their right. On his flanks he placed 100 halfling archers in the fields of each farm. Beyond the farm on his right was a hill, topped with trees, and behind these trees he placed a force of 150 halfling slingers. Grimbold's army consisted of 150 of the King's Guard, mail-clad soldiers with shields and spears. He had a similar number of heavy cavalry, similarly armed, but mounted. There were 300 light infantry, split between unarmoured archers and men with javelins and shields. Finally, Ancred led a mixed group of some 150 men, survivors of the Battle of Fishpond, eager for revenge. Grimbold observed the spear halflings waiting for him. He arrayed his army in battle formation, with the King's Guardsmen in the centre and a line of archers in front of them. On his right he placed the cavalry, with a line of javelin-armed troops in front of them. Ancred and his men took up position on the left flank. Grimbold was wary of a halfling ambush. He therefore ordered his light troops forward to scout out the halfling forces. The archers moved toward the farm on the Skelding left, with the javelin men advancing on their right. The spearmen also started to move up, behind the light infantry. As the Skelding archers approached the farm, the halfling archers stationed in its fields, sheltered by a dry stone wall, loosed arrows at them, and an archery exchange ensued. Both sides suffered casualties, but the Skelding archers were in the open, and their losses were the greater. Meanwhile, on the Skelding left, the halfling slingers began to move forward across the hilltop, gliding silently through the trees. Seeing that the Skelding archers were being bested by their halfling counterparts, the Skelding javelin men moved to the left, intending to close with the halfling archers. But in doing so, they passed in front of the halfling slingers positioned alongside the spear halflings. A hail of slingshot thinned their ranks, and all the time more of the Skelding archers were being pierced by halfling arrows. And still, on the far left of the Skelding battle line, the larger group of halfling slingers continued to move forward, through the forest, and to the edge of the hilltop, looking down at Ancred and his men. Many of these halfling slingers had been present at the Battle of Fishpond. They were not scared of Ancred, nor of his men, and they wanted revenge for the death of Bungo Flabbyface. Ancred's band was therefore liberally pelted with slingshot. Although Ancred's force included some archers, the halflings were out of range of their bows, But Ancred also had a small number of slingers of his own, who hurled slingshot back at the halflings, with some success. Now, on the halfling left, the second band of halfling archers emerged from the fields where they had been concealed, moving forward and wheeling to their right, pouring arrows into the flank of the Skelding javelin men. This did not distract the Skeldings who were nearest to the first group of halfling archers from sending well-aimed javelins skimming over the wall, with lethal effect. But even as the javelin men commenced their work, the first group of halfling archers had completed theirs. The Skelding archers were no more. The first group of halfling archers did not have long to congratulate themselves on a job well done. Having hurled their javelins, a small group of Skeldings charged up to and over the wall and cut the halflings down. The main group of Skelding javelinmen was still suffering under a storm of slingshot from the halfling centre and arrows from the halfling left. Infuriated, they charged into the halfling slingers in front of them. The javelin men who had attacked the halfling archers also charged into the fray, and the halfling slingers were rapidly dispatched. But even as the halfling slingers in the centre met their fate, those on the Skelding left were finding their range, and Ancred's men were falling around him. As his men wavered and Ancred attempted to rally them, urging them forward, a slingshot struck his horse directly between the eyes. The horse reared, throwing Ancred from the saddle, a fall that broke his neck. And as his body lay lifeless on the ground, the halflings on the hill cheered and jeered. But there was some relief for Ancred's surviving men. The storm of halfling slingstones started to slacken and then ceased. The halfling slingers had run out of ammunition. They melted back into the woods from which they had emerged and withdrew from the field. In the centre, the second group of halfling archers had moved into a position where they could continue to shoot arrows at the Skelding javelineers. As their numbers were reduced still further, the surviving javelin men made a break for it, fleeing into the fields where the first group of halfling archers had met their end. But the second group of halfling archers were not going to let their comrades go unavenged. They pursued the javelin men into the field, loosing their last remaining arrows at them as they did so, before cornering them. The weight of halfling numbers was too much for the surviving javelin men, who were cut to shreds by halfling knives. Satisfied with this outcome, and having run out of arrows, the second group of halfling archers also decided that it was time for them to withdraw from the field. And now it was with a grim satisfaction that Grimbald surveyed the scene in front of him. The Skelding light infantry had suffered grievously, but had done their job. Ancred was a troublemaker, and Grimbald would not miss him, and Ancred's men had soaked up a lot of punishment that might otherwise have been directed at the Skelding spearmen or cavalry. It was now time for those spearmen and cavalry to go to their work, and only the spear halflings stood between him and Overwater. He ordered his remaining forces to advance. The soldiers of the King's Guard marched in perfect formation, halting a few yards from the waiting ranks of spear halflings. Behind the King's Guardsmen and to their right was the Skelding cavalry, and to the left were the remnants of Ancred's men, filled with wild anger and rage, wanting only to slaughter halflings and avenge their leader. Grimbald shouted an order, and the King's Guardsmen charged into the halflings in front of them. Simultaneously, Ancred's men charged into the halfling right, but the Skelding cavalry, led by Grimbald's nephew Godric, were held back. Godric was young and inexperienced, and he was leading men of high birth. Grimbald did not wish to risk their lives unnecessarily. The King's Guard and Ancred's men were more than capable of finishing this job. The halflings fought ferociously. Many of the attackers were thrown back, but many gaps were opened in the halfling ranks. Undeterred, the halflings in the second rank surged forward, pushing still more of their attackers back. But the halflings had lost half of their number, and while they had pushed back many of their assailants, the halfling spears were not penetrating the armour of the Skeldings. Having gained some respite, the halflings fell back and regrouped around their banner. But then once more the Skeldings charged into them. Again the halflings repulsed the assault, and again, having done so, the halflings fell back and regrouped. But the halflings' numbers were ever dwindling. And now the Skeldings charged for a third time, surrounding the halflings. The unknown halfling with the banner, the hero who had inspired this glorious day of futile halfling gallantry, was cut down, and his fellows with him. Thus ended the Battle of Overwater.